A bombshell statement was made out of Belarus yesterday. And in combination with other things that we learned this week, this gives you a kind of picture of where things are and where they're probably going. And there could be a big change coming up pretty soon. This is Lukashenko yesterday talking to the reporters after his meeting with Putin.
There's a good proposal on the table. President Putin and I discussed it. I won't talk about it. The president will say that himself. A good proposal. The proposal for Ukraine, which, among other things, was heard by Donald Trump in Alaska, was taken to Washington for consideration and discussion. A very good proposal. If the Ukrainians don't accept these proposals, it will be like at the beginning of the Cold War. It will be even worse. They will lose Ukraine.
He's saying, hey, there's a proposal on the table. Apparently this was told to Trump in Alaska, and he said it's a fair proposal. According to Russia's interpretation, certainly it's not going to be agreed to in terms of fair by anybody in the West. But that's neither here nor there, because what is very much here and there is the realities on the battlefield. All of the decisive advantages are on the Russian side. So there's no reason why anyone in the West should confuse themselves and delude themselves to think that they can compel compliance on the side that has the most power. Ukraine is hurting Russia. They continue to fire long-range weapons, including some domestically produced drones that are having a real effect. I saw yesterday that Russia has now gone to a rationing situation in many parts of the country, a number of parts of the country, in fuel, because 17% of their refinement capacity has been taken offline by these attacks. Not a minor amount. And it now is having a physical impact on the amount of fuel that's able to go. They have stopped exports, I think, through at least the end of December, and then they'll reassess. Of course, they're trying to get those things done, but it's a meaningful hit. That's nearly a fifth of all of their capacity. Now, of course, you can certainly understand that they'll ration to the civilian population before the military will be shortchanged 1 gallon of fuel. So that's not going to have any impact on the actual war, but it's certainly causing some pain among the Russian population. But when you look at the overall in terms of the manpower, the numbers, the drones, the aircraft, the glide bombs, the missiles, the strategic drones, the tactical drones, all of that stuff together, of course, is irrevocably and decisively on the Russian side. They're aware of that. They're not fooled like the West is trying to fool itself. So now then, apparently, Putin sounds like, from what was described there, and we'll see when this becomes public, but Lukashenko saying it out loud after having met with Putin implies probably something's coming pretty quick, that he's basically prepared to issue an ultimatum. Now, I thought, and I think I said on this show here during this past summer, earlier in the summer, about the midway, that I thought that the deal that, especially around the Alaska time, I said, this is probably going to represent the last chance for diplomacy. And if this is not accepted, then I think it's going to turn into, okay, now then we're just eschewing any kind of diplomatic possibility, and we're just going to win on the battlefield. You've seen John Mearsheimer on our show, I think as recently as this week also, just say, yeah, that's what's coming. There's going to be a victory on the battlefield. There's no more possibility. Now it looks like that Putin may be close to saying that out loud by saying either you do this, or as Lukashenko put it, we will take all of Ukraine. Now, you may say, well, that's just his being bluster. They only took 1% of their country in the past, like almost 2 years in terms of territorial acquisition. And they can want to do that, but they can't. I'm not convinced of that because from what I see, the way that they're conducting their operations on the front line does not match the industrial capacity that they have ginned up to. And what I suspect could be coming, for example, this Oreshnik, it's now been a year since it was employed, so they have done nothing but continue to put them in serial production. We don't know the number, but it's some probably decent number have been continued to be produced, so they're now stockpiling them. We also know that they're producing apparently something close to 1,000 of these long-range Guarantus, the drones, per day in Russia. But you see, occasionally they'll get up to, like they did 800 the other day. But usually it's like 200, 300, 400. It's not a small number, but not anywhere close to being as much as the production capacity. Ergo, the logic is they are stockpiling those in large numbers. Now, with their the Ukraine side's limited air defense capacity, right now they can handle those kinds of numbers. A fair percentage gets through. But a pretty sizable percentage, bigger than what might seem reasonable given the alleged disparity in air defense, is shot down. It's actually for very many things, not just air defense missiles. It's lots of other ways, machine guns, other air defense, artillery, lots of things go into it. And they get a pretty decent percentage out. It's not enough, because that's why Russia keeps just going more than they have, and it hits all these places, and they still cause damage throughout the country. But now imagine this. Imagine on the day that Russia says, okay, we've stockpiled tens of thousands of these things. And now then we're going to go, like in one massive night, one blow, we're going to send a wave of 1,000 of these things, and they're going to spread throughout. And then 20 minutes later, another wave of 1,000 come through. And then 20 minutes later, another wave of 1,000 come through. They could launch 6, 7, 8, 10,000 in a single night. And I promise you, part of it even is not even the amount of ammunition that the Ukraine side has to shoot this down, but you also, in some of these, especially when the missiles, you've got to, it takes time to reload the batteries of the Patriots and other Iris-T and other kinds of air defense systems. And if you have that many coming across, and especially if there's plenty of missiles to go along with it, you can't even reload fast enough. So that on that second, maybe third wave of things coming through, when that fourth and fifth waves come through, it's nothing. All 1,000 could conceivably hit their targets, and it could just cause wipeout, devastate. We've never seen that. We've never seen wave after wave after wave of these kinds of strikes. We've just seen single waves, relatively speaking. They come in serials, but it's small numbers, so that the total, the most they ever had was 800 in a single night. Usually it's less than that, so the waves are pretty small. But if you have where they have massive waves, and presumably they have those in stockpile, so that could change a lot. And if you start adding in Oreshnik missiles, they could just flip a switch, and it could just be catastrophe falling on the Ukraine side. We have all, and including the Ukraine side, has kind of gotten into their mind this mentality of how that we can absorb these. So this is kind of all these things that are going on in the front line, especially in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk, which is where Russia continues to make the most progress. Even when there's a small, in north of Pokrovsk, there is a Ukraine counteroffensive that might have a whole Russian pocket cut off pretty soon. But in the city of Pokrovsk itself, Russia has now moved into, and even more into, the entire western part of that country. Yesterday, they announced that we're waiting to get confirmation of that. Meanwhile, in Kupiansk, they continue to move further inside the city. So those two pretty major cities are starting to fall, but it's still relatively slow. It's happening, but it's slow. But now on the day that mentality, you can handle that, you can move resources around or reserves. But when there is this massive attack like this, which apparently Russia has the capacity, it could collapse their entire defense in a minute. And one wonders if that's in the minds of Vladimir Putin, as discussed through Lukashenko, because he's talking about you'll lose all of your country. So to make that statement when you've only taken 1% in 2 years, that implies that you have something else in mind, that maybe we're going to do something different. And I don't know if they're going to do this, but if they, that would be a material, massive difference on the front line, because nobody's mentality is used to that. Everybody has gotten really comfortable with how things have worked for the last 3.5 years. The Ukraine side, they can handle all of these. I think there's, depending on the day, 5,000 to 6,000 FPV drones or bomber drones, et cetera. It's going on the tactical front. Lots of, I think, 40 to 80 airstrikes, glide bombs, et cetera. So they've kind of gotten used to that. That's now just the normal. They can deal with that. But if you overwhelm the systems with the senses with something much bigger, that's where you have a chance to actually have a complete break. And of course, the casualties alone from that much firepower could dwarf anything that we've seen so far. So I wonder if that's something that's have in mind, because if Putin is making this claim that basically, I'm going to give you an ultimatum, you can either surrender or we're going to take your whole country, implies that there's something different, because otherwise, that's, I think the BBC, or maybe it was the MI6 estimated earlier this summer that it would take like 4 years at current pace to be able to win. And I don't think that that's what Putin has in mind here, but we'll wait to be seen. It's something that we need to pay attention to. But Zelensky, on the other hand, doesn't seem to be taking this very seriously. In fact, he seems to be saying, not only are we not going to agree to that, I'm not ultimately even going to cede any territory at all.
Are there any territorial concessions that you would agree in order for to get a deal that ends the war?
We will never recognize these territories, which are temporarily occupied, like the territories of Russia. We can't do it. Situation. If tomorrow will be a ceasefire, everybody's standing. If we don't have power to bring back these territories, so we are ready to speak about it. We are ready to get it back sometime in the future by diplomatic way, not with weapon. And I think this is good compromise for everybody. It's been that we have to decide such things now in dialogue.
So, all right, let's break that down a little bit. So, on the one hand, he seems to be, for the first time in a long time, a little conciliatory. Okay, well, we don't have the power to get everything back right now, so we'll get it back diplomatically. So, what he's saying is, I'm willing to bring the war to an end and sign some kind of document. He's implying, and as long as I retain control over this part of Ukraine. He said separately that I would have an election after that. Once there's a ceasefire, I'll have election. I don't think I'll run for it. I'll believe that when I see it. But in any case, he says he wants something. He wants some kind of deal that leaves the rest of Ukraine on the other side of the line of contact, because apparently that's what he's willing to concede, what he doesn't have control of. He did not say anything about giving up the Donbass, the part that he currently occupies that Russia has said is non-negotiable. He didn't address that, but at least he's thinking, okay, we'll give this up in theory, but we're not going to recognize it, that he's going to want the West not to recognize it, so that in the future we can get it back through diplomatic means. So what you're telling Russia, who, as I just described, is in the irrevocable power dynamic, that they have all the cards that determine who wins and who loses a war of attrition. You're asking them to agree to something that, okay, we'll give you about 40% of what you're asking for. Okay, fine. We'll submit to that 40% as opposed to no percent. So it's a big give from Zelensky's perspective. But you're asking Russia to agree to something that says, okay, you are not going to get any of the territory where ethnic Russians are in the remainder of the administrative borders of those 4 oblasts, which is in the Russia's constitution. And there will be no protections for the other ethnic Russians who are in, I think it's the next 4 or 5 oblasts to the east, to the west of that. And you're not even going to get recognition for these territories here. And we have the express intent to collect them again later by other means. So the very reasons why you went to war there will continue to exist afterwards. Now, what possible reason would Russia have to agree to that? I mean, you would literally, from a position of power, say, all right, I tell you what here's the things that you want. We'll make sure you don't get 60% of those, and you'll agree to this, and I'll consider it my duty and honor to agree to you losing 60% of what you're demanding. I mean, why would anyone do that? Yeah, here's Zelensky, who's on the exact opposite end of this power dynamic, and he's still demanding things. Now, imagine how much less the guy who is in the dominant position is going to concede such a huge percentage of that leaves this guy in power. They're simply not going to do it. It's not even on the table for discussion, and we should recognize that. Somebody else who doesn't recognize that was yesterday. At least the video was released yesterday. But today, Zelensky was even more boisterous and in your face on Russia.
Реально хворі війною. І чи можливо їх вилікувати? Це питання. Єдине, що може примусити цей російський вірус війни зупинитись, це сила. Сильні рішення, сильна допомога. Ми говорили про це в Нью-Йорку з багатьма нашими близькими партнерами. Звісно, говорили з президентом Трампом. Президент Трамп дуже добре поінформований по ситуації на фронті про те, що росіяни роблять і в чому вони намагаються усіх обманути. Ми говоримо з Америкою про конкретні речі, які можуть зупинити цю війну. Рецепти є. Важливо, щоб було реалізовано те, про що ми домовляємось.
So you see there, he's talking about, my conversations with President Trump. They understand that. So he's got his own plan. Now, again, you're talking yesterday to today. One hand, you're talking about maybe having a negotiated settlement and you'll cede certain amounts of territory, at least on paper. But then the next day you're saying, no, this side is sick with war and we've got to stop them. And I'm working with President Trump to get that done. I mean, that by itself is like, which is the real Zelensky? Now, you factor on top of that something he said a couple of days ago about telling the Russians they need to make sure they know where their bomb shelters are.
Prime Minister's office.
Yeah, they attacked.
So if, what would you tell somebody who works at the Kremlin today? Would you tell him to make sure he knows where the nearest bomb shelter is?
First of all, they have to know where their bomb shelters are. If they will not stop the war, they will need it.
If they don't stop the war, they'll need it. So apparently he's implying that they have all this really big strike capability that they're withholding, that they're not using, and those darn Russians better understand a big threat to it. So it's almost like beforehand that he gave this something close to an veiled ultimatum to Russia. You either end this war or I'm coming after Moscow. And I'm going to get there. You better know where your bomb shelters are, of course. Naturally, that was mocked on the Russian side. Dmitry Medvedev, who can always be counted on to provide a little dark gallows humor when stuff like this comes out, did not hesitate to call out the absurdity of that and to say, by the way, I shouldn't have to say this out loud, but whatever Zelensky may have in mind, and he does have some long-range drones. They have tried many times to hit Moscow, and most of them have been shot down. Some have actually struck targets on the outside of Moscow. But should he ever actually get something through and hit something of meaning inside of Moscow, there's these things called the Oreshnik missiles that there is no defense against. And it doesn't matter. I'm talking Zelensky's bunker probably would not stop the kinetic power of those missiles. So not sure that's really something he wants, because whereas the bomb shelters might work for those in Moscow, they're not going to work. Okay, great. Gary, as usual, is on top of it and right there. You can see what he said there. So he wasn't exactly quaking in his boots. Yeah, and he said, the bomb shelter won't protect what Russia can use weapons. That's, of course, he's talking about the Oreshnik. That's probably not bad advice there that the Ukraine side needs to keep in mind. If they have something that can reach and do damage in Moscow, would not help the war effort out at all. In fact, it might even sign his own death warrant. That's just the reality and the ugliness of war. But one of the things that Zelensky mentioned in that first Axios clip that I showed you there, he's talking about his personal relationship with Trump and how Trump is, he thinks he's got a good deal worked out for them. Well, David Petraeus, also this past week, one of the things we discovered was that he thinks that Trump may have been a little naive.
I very much agree with what the ambassador just said in many, many respects, with one exception, and that is that I think that the EU and NATO have done more and more credible actions than I think he was giving credit for. Again, you noted, I was in Brussels. I met with the chairman of the NATO Military Committee, met with a number of EU officials in President von der Leyen's office, and then in the office of the foreign minister, if you will, and so forth. But my conclusion for this group, keep in mind I'm a former soldier and spy master, not a former diplomat, so this will be somewhat blunt. But my view is that President Trump rightly tried to use his personal relationship with President Putin to bring the killing to an end. He literally rolled out the red carpet, had the big meeting in Anchorage, and Putin has answered by sending the most drones and missiles into Ukraine skies on several different occasions.
Now, here's the problem with that. That last part is accurate. That is, I'm not sure it's entirely accurate to say that's how Putin responded, because Putin was always doing that. I mean, they've been doing these air attacks across the country for years. I mean, really since I'd say about October, November of 2023, all the way through current. So almost 2 full years they've been doing this on and off, sometimes higher level, sometimes lower level. So it was nothing new. So if you want to call it an answer to that, it preceded the question. So you can do with that whatever you want. But they have ramped it up. And so I do think that there was a message in there that what President Trump, as Lukashenko mentioned there, the Russian side did convey in Alaska what their conditions would be, what they're willing to, how they're willing to end the war, what they need, what they require. And it's part of the weirdness. I don't know if it's an absence of ability to understand, whether it's a lack of willingness to acknowledge what was said. I don't know. But of course, after that meeting, Trump said, well, I thought we had a deal, which is apparently not the same deal that Putin had in mind, because Trump seemed to think that there was going to be a deal almost like the Zelensky version, where Russia would not get 60% of what it was asking for. But Russia apparently has not changed it. I'm guessing that their deal that he was referring to, or probably that 12-point plan that Russia gave to Ukraine on their second of the current round of meetings in Istanbul, this 12-point plan, where they're basically a recitation of what the deal that Putin gave in June of 2024. So again, they never changed their minds here, and they never changed their objectives. So now I think that you see that there was a message. It was that Putin was saying, look, our capacity is continuing to escalate. So the imbalance I keep talking to you about isn't static. It continues to advance in the Russian favor. And I think he's demonstrating that and saying, we can, in a sense, with actions, not with words, he's saying we can do this the easy way or the hard way. And we would prefer to do it the easy way. But as Trump always says, he's very polite in their conversations and they're very respectful, but the actions are concrete and saying, this is where we're going. And if you don't agree to these terms here, we're not going to agree to anything less, because we don't have to concede 5%, much less 60%. They're not going to do it. So that's one of the things that Petraeus doesn't seem to recognize. And so he says, yeah, Trump tried to do it. He tried to say, hey, we can do it this way. But now this personal interaction between Putin didn't work. And now that's his answer, implying then, and he went on to say in his other remarks, that we need to do other things. And we need to step up the sanctions. We need to step up the weapons that we give to Ukraine, et cetera. And that's what it bears repeating again. That's I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to use this term. It's kind of a sickness of the foreign policy elite in the Western world, not just the United States. But the fact that, and you heard him bragging about all these people that Petraeus at the start of that clip that he'd been talking to, Ursula von der Leyen, NATO, Brussels, certainly Kiev, all these people, he's on all these different places. He talks to all these because they listen to him. They're actually asking his opinion. And he is saying that we need to just do more sanctions, more of what didn't work, more weapons, more of what didn't work in the past 3.5 years. There's no rational, logical view, especially when Putin is demonstrating that the balance continues to go out of whack against their side. And you're suggesting that with far, far fewer inputs, you want to try and repeat what has already graphically failed in the past. It's no logical sense, and yet that's where we are. And Trump, as he always says, I'm unhappy with this. I don't like what Putin's doing, et cetera. And I think it was this week also, the Russian ambassador to UK was interviewed, and they asked him, what do you think about Trump's being unhappy with Putin?
Trump is saying he's very disappointed by Putin, that Putin has let him down. That he has a great relationship, but it doesn't make any difference. So he's clearly annoyed.
And so what? Is
that the point? Is that your position? So what? It doesn't matter.
Do you think we should be guided by his controversial statements each time? Not at all. We are in operation, a serious operation. Situation in Ukrainian conflict, it is fundamental interest for us. We needed to resolve it once and forever. What President Trump is doing is, of course, this is for the benefit of the military-industrial complex of the United States, and it is easy because they are selling now this weapon for European money, and it's big money, really. Of course, this does not bring a settlement closer. It is only delaying all of that.
Listen, you don't have to be a Russian apologist or any even pro-Russian at all. In fact, you can do the contrary. You can hate Russia. You can despise everything that they're doing in Ukraine, and you still have to acknowledge, if you're being honest and accurate, what he said there. He said all of these things that they're doing, all the things that Petraeus said we want to try, all the things that Lindsey Graham says that he wants to do, all these alleged, which still haven't materialized, additional secondary sanctions on other countries, China, India, Brazil, etc. All these additional military packages, so that whatever the European Union can come up together and whatever they can scrap together to try and put something on the table, these $1 billion per month that allegedly the United States is going to give to Ukraine. All these things do is just, as I put it in different terms, I say all it does is increase the cost of Ukraine's ultimate loss, which is already baked in. Can't be avoided anymore. Can't be avoided. So while we go for the militarily and economically unattainable objectives to try and repeat things that have already failed in the past, all we do is increase the loss to the Ukrainian people, to the Ukrainian country, their territory, everything else. Listen, this comment by Lukashenko, you can never take anything at face value, but you have to put it in context of what we can observe. And when he says that this deal that Putin is apparently on the table, that is already on the table, apparently known behind the scenes, both to Ukraine and to the West, that it's either this or all of Ukraine will be lost. There's reason to say maybe he means that. And maybe they have more capacity than we have come to believe so far. Problem is that because we haven't seen it demonstrated, there's nobody in the West that believes this. I've had so many conversations with otherwise very intelligent people, open-minded people, etc. And they, especially in the United States, but some in Europe as well, they are absolutely convinced that Russia can't win this. That this analysis of I think it was in the BBC during the summer, of it'll take 4.5 years more for Russia to be able to just get the Donbass, forget about even going to the Dnieper River, much less all of the country, meaning that's a bridge too far. They don't even have the capacity to do that. They believe that. So they feel comfortable and confident in just going, yeah, whatever he said. We're going to keep doing this. And what we're going to do, and I think their mentality is because they believe that Russia can't, then they say, but so what we'll do is we'll just keep this death by 1,000 cuts strategy going, and we'll keep the pipeline open, and we'll keep hurting Russia. So at some point, apparently, they'll get tired of it. The cost will be too high. Ukraine will have enough of these long-range drones to get better technology, the better able to evade the Russian air defenses, and they will take that not 17% of their fuel capacity refinement, but down to 20%, 30%, 50%, in time 60% maybe, and just devastate the Russian economy. And then they'll have to pull down. They'll have to back off, and then they'll give us what we're asking for. I think that's the mentality here. And if what they think is true, it's at least an entertainable idea, because you can say, yeah, maybe in time that'll happen. But even that perversely says, yeah, and in those years, I'm cool with more tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men being killed in combat. I'm okay with additional generations of Ukrainian men paying that price. Because even if you say, yeah, just imagine the absurdity of the mentality here. Let's say that it's that 4-year period. They actually believe that, and their calculations are based on what they've seen on the battlefield. That's how long it would take. This is what Russia's doing is all it can do, but it will keep doing it, and it will keep nibbling away until it gets set in 4 years. And then they're saying that maybe sometimes in that 4 years that Russia is going to, because of the difficulty with their economy back home, that they won't be able to maintain even that, and then at some point they'll just peter out. And then what? What do you think is going to happen then? They're just going to go away? That they're just going to say, all right, boys, pack up your gear. Let's head back to Russia. All right, here's your country back. It's kind of bombed up a little bit, but it sucks and we don't want to do it anymore, so we're going to go home. Does somebody think that's going to happen? However many more years this takes, that's probably hundreds of thousands of men who are alive as I make this video, who will be dead then, on top of all of these casualties that have existed before. So the best case scenario is that now then the line, instead of being where it's at right here, will be somewhat further to the west, even in your best case scenario. And what? You still don't have the power to push Russia back. So even wherever that line is going to be, the Russians, even in that condition there, would then go to defense like they did in 2022 or 2023, late 2022. They'll start building defensive lines again, and now then maybe there'll be a pause where they rebuild their strength over some number of years, and then they would certainly continue on. They're not just going to say, all right, that's it, we're done forever. See, there's no logic behind what they're doing. They only have this idea that maybe sometime Russia could get tired, but even they don't follow that through. They don't even go through the logic of saying, and what would that look like? How would that help the Ukraine side? It won't. It'll just move the pause line, and I'll say the pause line won't be an end because Russia will have no motivation to actually end. At the best, they might do a temporary truce or something, or you have the case in the North and South Korea where they had the armistice. They didn't end the war, and Russia would probably say, all right, we'll just wait and we retool. I mean, even in that scenario, again, your best case scenario, Russia would at that point say, all right, well, let's lick our wounds for a while, rebuild our strength, and then continue on at a time of our choosing. Meanwhile, whatever's left on the Ukraine side, they'll have that same intent. But now then their manpower pool is now hundreds of thousands less than it was on top of where it is right now. So you can't ever get the combat power necessary, and it'll take a generation to even have the theoretical possibility of mounting something to drive the Russians back. And you're never going to do that because Russia has nuclear weapons. So even if you started doing something like that and had some success 4 or 5 years, 6 years from now, it's not going to go anywhere any more than it did in the first time. So you really start to see, if you're being honest and looking at the logic behind all this, there is no path at all for success for the Ukraine side. But we're the David Petraeuses, the Ursula von der Leyens, the Emmanuel Macrons, the Keir Starmers are having this high rhetoric and this lofty statements about how they're doing the right thing, oblivious to the fact or unconcerned about the fact that they are sacrificing generation after generation of Ukrainian men and losing square kilometer after square kilometer of Ukrainian territory that will certainly never come back. There's no rational path to get that done. That is my biggest beef, as you can probably see, with everything that the West is doing. It is not built on any kind of rational analysis. It is just built on hope in absence of any fundamental reasons to do so.